Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be talking a little bit about the concept of biological communities. So in our previous discussion we had learned all about ecosystems, and we know that ecosystems are places where we have living or biotic and non-living abiotic components interacting with each other. So it includes all of the living things in an area and also their non-living environment, so the water and the sun and the temperature and the soil and all of those types of things. And these living things are interacting with these, right? They're interacting with each other in a series of different types of relationships, which we talked about, competition and mutualism and predation and all of those other things we discussed. And then also we see that they're interacting with their non-living environment. We see that materials are cycling through. We see that energy is flowing through. So there was a lot of different sort of big concepts we learned there. But let's now take a look at just the living stuff inside of the ecosystem. And just the living stuff inside of the ecosystem would include all of the species, all of the things that are alive, and we call these biological communities. And there's a couple of different ways that we can look at a community. And why, first of all, why is it important to be in a community? Well, it's important for all of those reasons we learned about when we were talking about ecosystems, right? Species rely and depend on each other. They need sources of food, which could be another animal or could be a plant. They need to have places where they can meet their basic needs, food, water, shelter, and space. And so you need, for most of those things, especially shelters, especially food, you need other living things in your community. So this idea is that you always have groups of living things that are in an environment. So it's important to have, again, ideally, as many different things as we can. And the more different living things we have in these communities, the more likely it is that this group of living things can survive. So there's a few different properties that we can talk about when we're looking at community diversity. We can talk about something called diversity and abundance, and we'll talk about the difference between those. We can look at the structure of the living things, so kind of what order are they, I'm going to call it distributed if you want to think of it that way. And we can also look at things like complexity, resilience, productivity, and stability. I'm not going to go through some of these. It's a little bit more higher level in some cases. I'm just going to focus on this kind of last part here, which is stability. So first let's talk about the difference between diversity and abundance. And this is something that is going to be reinforced in some of the labs that we are doing, particularly on campus. For those of you who came to lab early in the semester, you had a plant diversity lab. The rest of you probably had the wildlife diversity lab. So this idea of diversity and abundance is something that we're somewhat familiar with because of our labs. So diversity is the number of different kinds of living things in an area. Okay, so if we are talking about the prairie at Harper College, which is where we did a lot of our labs, or going to do a lot of our labs, we want to know how many different kinds of plants we have, or how many different types of birds we have. So diversity is just the number of different things we have. Abundance refers to the number of individuals of a particular species in an area. So we want to know if we have a lot of one type of thing. So going back to the birds, let's say when we were looking at birds in the prairie, we saw lots and lots of field sparrows, okay? And then we maybe saw a couple of other different birds, right? So maybe we saw 10 field sparrows, but we also saw a cardinal and maybe a couple of robins. The abundance then would tell us that there's an abundance of those field sparrows, right? So it refers to the number that we have. Diversity and abundance are often related. Typically when we see high diversity in a community, we don't usually see a lot of any one single species. The idea is that we've got a few of lots of different species, which is great. But there are some examples where you will have communities that contain just a few very common species. and maybe just one or two of something that's very rare. So in the case of the birds we were just talking about, you might see the same of several different common species, but the rarer species are going to be a little harder to come by. So in any given community, we can talk about the structure of the community. And the structure is just a way to look at how species are distributed. So if we were to walk into an ecosystem and we were to take a look around, is there any kind of pattern that we can detect on where we can find these things? And there's three different types of patterns that we look for in a community. First is random. So random is just everybody is where everybody is based on where the resources are. So this is a really good example of plants. Plants typically have what we call this randomly distributed population. They will grow as long as there is an open space for them and some sunlight and some water. They'll pretty much settle whatever they want. Ordered or uniform patterns often arise from competition and territoriality. So you might find that you only have a certain number of squirrels on Harper's campus and they're not distributed evenly. So you don't see that every tree happens to have a squirrel. You might find that the squirrels are in very specific locations, and those locations are probably due to squirrels competing with each other for nesting spaces. They're competing with each other for food. So they're not random, like the first example. And last but not least is clustered. So clustered patterns happen when you see species clumping together for a particular reason. Maybe it's because there's safety in numbers, and so the more of them there are together, the better off they are. So these are some just pictures that illustrate these different types of what we're calling distribution patterns. So again, random is a really good example of plants. It's a fairly random distribution wherever they can find a space to grow and they have what they need. Uniform patterns, again, are a little bit more, in this case they're using penguins as an example, but you can see that they are sort of distributed by where there's this nesting space available, right? So there's kind of one penguin per nesting space or two penguins per nesting space if you think about this. And so it's got kind of an order to it. So again, could be with trees or any other resource that animals might need. And last but not least is clustered. Schools of fish are a fantastic example of this. Schools of fish will cluster together because there's safety in numbers, because it's easier to avoid predation when you're in a large group versus if you're all spread out from each other. Also keep in mind that communities can be distributed vertically. So you might have different distribution patterns at different levels of an ecosystem. So rainforests are a fantastic example of that. You might have one distribution pattern of species at the bottom or the floor of the rainforest, and you may have different distribution patterns as you move your way up into the canopy, for example. So lots of different ways we can think about how communities are distributed. The next thing I want to talk about is change in a community. So for the longest time, ecologists used to think that a stable community was a community that doesn't change, that it just stays the same and it just functions the way that it functions, and things don't shift and things don't move other than, population sizes, right? So population sizes go up and down based on some of those principles we talked about last time. Predation, for example, is one of those. But they really thought that, again, that if a community was stable, that was like the healthiest type of ecosystem you could have, right? Because, it's not changing. We know that it's reliable. But we find now that actually periodic change, even a dramatic periodic change, is kind of a new normal is part of normal for ecosystems. You don't always have constant stability. You have things that are changing. And maybe it might be in the case of a forest, for example, you might have a short fire that occurs because of a lightning strike, right? And you'll have a small fire that will burn, and it will burn some of the forest. But then you'll see that in the wake of that other things come and colonize and grow in that area. And that's okay. The ecosystem isn't worse off for that. As a matter of fact, the more diversity we have in an ecosystem, the better it is able to adapt and kind of roll with these changes. So in general, what we've learned that the types of living things, these biological communities, change over time, and they change according to what is going on in the environment. And the big question right now in environmental science is, as humans, we are the biggest agents of change that's going on in these environments. And so can ecosystems adapt? Can these biological communities adapt to the changes that we're introducing? Not natural changes, but human-made changes. So that's a question that we have to kind of ponder this semester. So there's a particular term that we use that describes how a community changes over time if given a set of conditions. So it's basically like we know what type of communities to look for as different changes happen, and that's just what succession is. There's two types, primary and secondary. So primary succession happens when you have a place where nothing has ever lived before, and all of a sudden it's colonized by living organisms. Or in the case of something that hasn't had anything living in a long, long time. So let's take, for example, glaciers. So as glaciers are receding in different parts of the world, they are creating bare land that hasn't had anything living on it in thousands and tens of thousands of years. There's been nothing on that land. So as those glaciers recede and that bare soil is now available, you're going to see things start to move on and colonize that bare soil. That's called primary succession. Secondary succession is where you have an established community and then you have a disturbance that happens. So again, mostly that disturbance comes in the form of fire, but it also could come in the form of, in a forest, you could have logging, for example. So logging that removes a large portion of trees, that's going to create quite a big disturbance. And what we see then is another community that kind of develops from the previous one. So if you're looking at what we call primary ecological succession, this is kind of the route it takes. So we have some exposed area. It could be soil, it could be bare rocks, it could be anything. Over time, the first thing that comes into that community are lichens and moss. They have very little needs. They don't need soil per se. They can cling on to just about anything. And over time, lichens and moss will actually change the rocks themselves. They will help to weather and break them down. And once we have a little bit of a soil bed, then you'll start to get some other things that come in and colonize, like grasses and herbs and shrubs and even some tree seedlings. And again, as more time progresses, eventually we have more and more soil development, and we can have different types of trees that come into these communities. But again, you don't see primary succession a lot. This is, again, mostly where you'd have to have an area that's not had anything living on it, which, again, isn't a frequent condition. More likely what you're often going to see is you're going to see this secondary type of succession. And secondary succession happens when you have some type of a disturbance. So a disturbance is anything that disrupts the pattern of species diversity, abundance, or community structure, right? So fires, floods, those are things that we have typically seen, again, kind of on a more weather natural scale. However, I also mentioned that we have human-induced disturbances now as well. What's interesting to note is that there are some ecosystems that are actually designed to have periodic disturbances. Certain types of forests, prairies, for example. Prairies are a type of grassland ecosystem that was native to our state, and they were used to periodic burning. That's how those plants adapted. You get rid of the trees and the woody species because they can't survive the fire, but the grasses and the flowers, they do really well with that. And so we call these types of ecosystems or these types of communities, if you will, disturbance adapted species. So what you'll see then is you'll see an area, this is and just an example, so remember I was talking about, cutting forests, for example. So this is an area where we had some forests that were cut, and you can see that the plants are making a very slow comeback. Trees in particular don't bounce back quickly from being cut down or burned down. However, you will see a variety of other species that kind of pop up. But then you'll have other communities that actually do recover from disturbances very quickly. And this is a pine forest, and you can see these pines are actually pretty fast growing compared to the burnt pines that were left behind. But even prairies, for example, they're adapted to be burned. And our prairie here at Harper is going to be burned sometime this fall. We have a management company that is going to come in, and they are going to do a fall burn. So you will see that the prairie, those grasses, again, those grasses and those flowers are going to come back really well next year because they're used to this, because all the important parts of the plant are down, deep down underground in their root system. The above ground part, it's just for the year. All they need it is to flower and to fruit and seed so that they can reproduce. Once they're done, they don't need the rest of that above ground body. So you burn that down, you start again fresh in the spring, and it gives them an advantage to some of the other plants that aren't adapted to that. All right, so we will end things there for communities. And again, you'll be talking